Legends of Greek Mythology, The 12 Labors of Hercules, Part 2. The fourth labor, the capture of Diana's stag. After King Eurystheus had been pulled out of the bronze pot and was seated upon his throne again, he set his wits to work to think of something really hard for Hercules to do. In the great forests which lay on the borders of Arcadia roamed a very fleet stag. This stag had often befooled the hunters of that region. Very few had ever really seen it, and many people, perhaps King Eurystheus himself, believed that it lived only in hunters' stories. If these stories were to be believed, it had horns of gold and hoofs of brass, could take the most wonderful leaps, and was never tired, no matter how long the dogs had been chasing it. It had been seen browsing, oftener than anywhere else, close to the steps of Diana's temple, and many people believed that it was under her protection. For the fourth labor, Eurystheus told Hercules to catch this stag and bring it back alive. So Hercules went to the Arcadian forests, and hiding himself in the undergrowth, watched all the paths near the temple of Diana. It was tiresome watching. Flies stung him, bright-eyed lizards ran over his feet, and a little owl came and hooted among the shadows of the temple. At last he saw the golden-antlered stag, and the sight of it was worth his long watch. He had never seen a more beautiful animal. It had great, soft eyes, and its golden antlers seemed like a wonderful crown. Hercules knew that he might never get another sight of this elusive creature, so as soon as he saw it, he darted out of his hiding place and began the chase. The stag led him through the forest and over the hills, across great rivers, and beyond the borders of Arcadia. Still it kept on, never tiring, and Hercules followed close behind it. The stag had never been pursued before by a foe that showed such endurance. On and on it went, with Hercules coming after, till the chase had lasted a whole year, when it began to show signs of fatigue. It had led Hercules over nearly the whole of Europe in a great circle, and now it brought him back to Diana's temple again. Panting and exhausted, it ran into the temple. Hercules followed and would have caught it even in that spot, which was sacred to Diana. But just then the moon burst out from a dark cloud, and looking up, Hercules suddenly saw Diana herself standing before him. She looked very tall, and her crown was like the new moon. At her feet crouched the stag, trembling. Diana said to Hercules, "You must not lay hands on this stag, as it belongs to me, but go back to King Eurystheus and merely tell him all that has happened, and he will consider that your fourth labor is accomplished." The fifth labor, the destruction of the Stymphalian birds. King Eurystheus now sent Hercules to drive away the Stymphalian birds. The valley of Stymphalus was often visited by enormous flocks of strange birds. These birds did great damage to the crops and to the herds, for it was an easy matter for them to kill a sheep or a cow and feed on the carcass. Besides, they had been known to carry off children. These birds had sharp claws of iron and feathers which were sharp at the quill end like the point of an arrow, and which they had the power of throwing at their enemies, as the porcupine was supposed to throw its quills. Of course, these birds must have been 1,000 times worse than any porcupine, because they could fly through the air and throw their feathers from above. Their nests were in a thick, dark wood, in the midst of which was a pool. Instead of trying to fight birds like these with his bow and arrows, or his club, or his hunting spears, Hercules thought of another plan. He went quietly to the edge of the pool, and holding his bronze shield above his head to protect himself from the bird's feathers, he rang a large bell, and at the same time beat upon the shield with his lance. The birds, frightened at the sudden clattering noise, flew up in such numbers that it seemed as if a great dark cloud had come over the sky. As they flew over the head of Hercules, their sharp feathers fell fast, rattling on the shield, and tearing the leaves of the surrounding trees into strips. Hercules kept on ringing the bell and beating the shield till every bird had left the wood except a half-dozen that had stayed behind to watch from the tops of the tallest trees. These few that were left he easily shot with his poisoned arrows. After this, the birds built their nests on the island of Mars and never came back to trouble the valley of Stymphalis. The sixth labor, the cleaning of the Augean stables. The next labor of Hercules was the cleaning of the Augean stables. King Eurystheus told him that he must do this work alone and do it in one day. King Augeas was a son of Helios and one of the heroes who sailed with Jason in the quest of the Golden Fleece. He was a king of Elis. His herds were so large that towards sundown, when the cattle came up to the stables from their pastures, they seemed to pour across the plains endlessly, as the fleecy white clouds, driven by the west wind, sometimes roll across the sky. Among these cattle were 12 snow-white bulls, which were sacred to Helios. One of them, the leader, was so very white that he shone among the other cattle like a star, and had been named Phaethon, after the son of Helios. When wild beasts, panthers or wolves or even lions came down from the mountains to attack the herds, as they often did, the 12 white bulls always went first to drive them back, lowering their curly foreheads, shaking their sharp horns, and bellowing as they went in a way to frighten any beast that ever roamed the plains. When Hercules went among the cattle of Augeas, he wore his lion's skin as usual. The wind brought the scent of the skin to Phaethon, who, connecting that scent with the worst of the enemies from which it was his duty to defend the herd, came rushing up to attack Hercules. But Hercules, being so exceedingly strong, had no fear of the bull. He simply caught him by one white horn, turned his head, and bent it to the ground, showing himself to be the master. After this, whenever Hercules came near, Phaethon stood off respectfully, and the other cattle followed his example. The stables of Augeas stood in a long line close to the bank of a river, and Hercules made quick work of this labor, for since the stables must be cleaned in one day, he dug a trench and turned the river through them. Numerous as the stables were, the running water soon swept them clean. The seventh labor, the capture of the Cretan bull. When Minos was chosen king of Crete, he wished to begin his reign by offering a sacrifice to Jupiter. Accordingly, he went down to the seashore and built a high altar of rough stones. Then he called on the sea god Neptune, asking him to send an animal for the sacrifice. He had scarcely expressed this desire before there rose up out of the sea a snow-white bull with silvery horns. There could not have been a more beautiful animal, or one more perfect for a sacrifice. But Minos thought it a pity that he could not keep such a superb creature, and when he found that it was gentle as well as perfect in every other respect, instead of sacrificing it on the altar that he had built, he led it to the pasture where his own herd was feeding and let it go. This was wrong because Neptune had sent the bull to be sacrificed to Jupiter, and for no other purpose. Therefore the gods caused the beautiful creature to lose its gentle disposition, and to become wild and dangerous. It roamed through the woods of Crete, and was a terror to everyone who lived on that island. At last King Eurystheus sent Hercules for his seventh labor to capture this Cretan bull. Armed only with his club, Hercules went into a wood where the bull had been oftenest seen, and waited by a spring. Soon he heard a hoarse bellowing, and caught a glimpse of something white through the trees. A moment later he saw the animal coming up to attack him, and tossing its white horns fiercely. Throwing his club to the ground, he caught the bull by the horns, and held it firmly in spite of its struggles, for he was the stronger of the two. When the bull saw that it had found its master, its former gentle disposition returned to it, and it forgot all its wild ways, and followed Hercules about as if it had been a pet lamb. Afterward, in taking it to Mycenae, Hercules let it swim across the sea, while he rode on its back. The eighth labor, the capture of the horses of Diomedes. Diomedes, a king of Thrace, was a fierce, war-loving monarch who was said to be a son of Mars. He had no regard for the laws of hospitality. When people were wrecked on his coasts, they were seldom heard from again. He had a pair of war horses so vicious and dangerous that they had to be fastened with chains. It was whispered that the reason why the horses of Diomedes were so very dangerous was that they were fed on human flesh. And furthermore, that this explained the complete disappearance of all who had been wrecked on the coasts of King Diomedes. King Eurystheus sent Hercules to bring the horses of Diomedes to Mycenae, and as usual, to make the task harder, he desired him to bring them alive. Hercules went to the country of Diomedes, and here he soon found that the dreadful reports he had heard about this ruler were all true. He went straight to the king's stables and easily overpowered the guards. Then he unfastened the horses, fierce as they were, and led them by their chains to the shore. But here he was overtaken by a crowd of angry men, all calling upon him to stop. He soon found himself fighting with King Diomedes himself. This strange king liked nothing better than fighting, and fully intended that Hercules should furnish a meal for his horses. But Hercules soon overpowered the king and made him a prisoner, thus putting an end to his cruelty. Then Hercules took the horses to Mycenae and presented them to King Eurystheus, who doubtless was delighted at receiving such a valuable present. The horses soon escaped from his stables and ran wild in the Arcadian hills, where they were finally eaten by wolves. The ninth labor, the securing of the girdle of Hippolyte. Soon after the capture of the horses of Diomedes, Hercules was sent off to the country of the Amazons to get Queen Hippolyte's girdle. The Amazons were a race of women who delighted in warfare and hunting. They lived at some distance from Greece, on the Caucasus Mountains and on the borders of the Black Sea. Their queen, Hippolyte, had a very famous girdle, which was a gift to her from Mars, the war god. It was said to be some magic power in this girdle which made the onslaught of the Amazons so like a rushing, irresistible storm. The Greeks, in their wars, had more than once found themselves opposed to the Amazons and knew them for a formidable enemy. The daughter of Eurystheus, who was a priestess, thought that Hercules could not do a better service for the Greeks than to secure this girdle of Queen Hippolyte, so Eurystheus sent him for it. Hercules therefore crossed the Black Sea and went to the country of the Amazons. He anchored his ship in the harbor, not far from the queen's palace, and Queen Hippolyte and some of her women went on board to see what had come among them. The queen, who was brave herself and admired courage in others, welcomed the famous Hercules in a kindly manner and gave him the girdle. But one of the Amazons, seeing the queen on board the ship, raised the cry that a stranger was carrying off Queen Hippolyte by force. The Amazons then armed themselves and flew toward the ship from all directions. In spite of this, Hercules escaped with the girdle, although not without fighting, and was soon crossing the Black Sea on his way home. When he reached Mycenae, he presented the famous girdle, which was set with precious stones and heavy with gold, to the daughter of King Eurystheus. So ended his ninth labor. The 10th labor, the fetching of the cattle of Geryon. You would think that all the monsters in the neighborhood of Mycenae must have been slain by this time, and all the nearby kings and queens who were enemies of King Eurystheus overcome. In fact, Eurystheus did find it necessary to send Hercules a long distance from Mycenae next time, for he ordered him to go to an island that lay just beyond the country where the sun sets and bring back the red cattle of the giant Geryon. This Geryon was a most extraordinary giant. He had 3 bodies, 3 heads, 6 legs, and 6 arms, besides a pair of wings. He had an enormous herd of cattle, which he kept at night in a dark cave. To aid him in this 10th labor, Hercules borrowed the golden cup in which the sun god Helios was borne round the world, from west to east, every night. This cup would float on the water like a boat, and had the remarkable power of becoming larger or smaller, according to the needs of the person using it. In it, Hercules was carried straight west for a long time, farther west than anyone had ever gone before. Oceanus, the god of the ocean, was angry at having his dominions invaded and raised a great storm. The golden cup was caught in a whirling cloud of spray and tossed up and down as if it had been a bubble. But Hercules, nothing daunted, aimed one of his arrows at Oceanus, who laughed heartily at this impertinence and then quieted the waters. When Hercules reached the island, he climbed a high mountain in order that he might look out over all the land and see where the cattle of Geryon were grazing. As he stood there, he was attacked by Gerion's savage two-headed dog. He killed the beast with his club, but hardly had time to draw a long breath before he was attacked by Gerion's herdsman, who was quite as savage as the dog, and would gladly have torn Hercules limb from limb. With a single blow from his ponderous club, he killed the herdsman also. Then he saw the cattle grazing in a meadow, and began to drive them away. By this time Geryon himself had seen him, and came striding toward him, swinging 6 clubs at a time with his 6 hands, and bellowing threats of death and destruction from all 3 of his huge throats at once. He looked like an animated windmill as he came down the hill, and would have frightened most people out of their wits. But Hercules remembered his poison arrows, and he sent a shaft so straight that it made an end of the giant before he came near enough to do any harm. Then Hercules gathered the cattle together and drove them into the cup of Helios, in which he transported them to the mainland. Afterwards, some of them died, having been attacked by enormous swarms of flies, and others were lost through meeting with robbers and giants. But he succeeded in driving the remainder all the way to Mycenae. End of Part 2.